Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video, and today we have the Manly Companion. Now, this is an interesting knife for a few reasons. Mostly what this knife does is it offers a slip joint knife that's two-handed opening, but then apart from that, tries to get as close as it can to the functionality of sort of a modern folder, okay? Now, there's a problem with that, and that is this. You know, people who are into slip joints, who are into more traditional knives, they're not going to find this all that appealing because it doesn't have that traditional feel and that traditional styling, okay? The other side of this coin that makes it problematic is that people who are into modern folders, you know, the Spydercos and Cold Steels and all of that, they're going to look at this and go, you know, I like the materials, I like the clip, maybe even I even like the look of this knife, and the steel is pretty good, but it's not locking and I can't flick it open. It's two-handed opening, and so it's going to put off some of that group as well. So it kind of lands in a weird place. Now I could say there's one other group, you know, people who are more into sort of modern folders but would like to try out a traditional. This might be interesting to them because they don't have to sacrifice everything they like about their modern folder while still getting sort of a taste of what a traditional is like, but then maybe, you know, not really. Okay, and so we'll talk about all of those things. One last point though, and that is if you are looking at a traditional knife and you want a fairly good quality of construction, a decent steel, those kinds of things, you know, often you end up looking at like GEC or Queen Cutlery or Northwoods knives or something like that, and those can be pretty pricey, all right? This comes in around 50 bucks, which is not all that bad, especially when you consider what you're getting. Okay, so that's the other consideration. You may say, hey, I want a good quality slip joint, but I don't want to pay $125 or $150 or $200, and that's another place I think this fits in. That's one of the reasons I was interested in this. By the way, I'll get into a fuller discussion of who might want this knife or what kind of uses I see for this knife or how I use it in my own collection kind of a little closer to the end. So now that we've had all that introduction, I think this knife, you know, the reason for it is because this knife does require a little more explanation. Let's go ahead and start looking at size, weight, and features. All right, so overall size on this guy is 8 inches, 3.5 inch blade, 4.5 inch handle. The weight is 3.84 ounces, and you can see if you look in here that those liners are milled out to save on that weight a little bit, making this a fairly lightweight knife, and it's really slim when closed, okay? So when you close this, it is pretty compact, and so because of the weight and because of the compact size, this does carry very, very comfortably. And so if you're looking for, you know, even, you know, maybe I could see someone carrying this as a secondary, you know, you've got your sort of tactical or defensive knife, you've got maybe a fixed blade that day, or maybe just a large knife and you want something that you could get out and cut up your kids' McNuggets with. This is a knife that's not very scary, and it's light enough and small enough that it could be carried in addition to another knife. All right. Okay, so there you go. That's the size, weight, and the introduction. Let's start talking now about the features, beginning with the D2 full flat ground blade. Okay. By the way, you're probably already noticing the different action that's on this, and we'll discuss that in a second. But before we do, let's talk about the blade. It is D2 steel. It does hold an edge pretty nicely. Fingerprints are going to be on this knife because you have to grip it this way every time. There's no really avoiding that. So that's kind of part of the deal here. It is very thinly ground. It's a full flat grind, and it's not super thick blade stock to begin with. And then here, there we go, get a focus on that. Notice that the tip is quite fine and the edge is quite fine. So this slices like crazy. It's gonna perform really well for, you know, your average EDC tasks. The one thing I will say about this is it's not a hard use, you know, overbuilt type of blade. And I mean, it's not a locking knife anyway. So, you know, that's not really, to me, much of a thing to consider because I don't see people thinking, I can't imagine anyone thinking, you know, I'm gonna really use this in a way that's extremely strenuous, because you're really taking a chance that you could close the knife on your hand. So I think that the blade is well suited to the purpose of this knife, which is really, light cutting tasks, EDC type cutting tasks. So that's the blade. I think the blade is well done. It has held an edge for me really, really well. So again, they seem to have heat treated this D2 to a pretty high level of hardness. By the way, while we're kind of on the D2 stuff, don't be afraid of D2 steel. You can see this has no corrosion on it, and I don't really, I don't go out of my way to baby or oil my D2 steel knives every day or anything. A drop of oil when I first get them, and that's about the last I ever think of it, and I've never had a problem with corrosion. So D2, although it's not a stainless, is not just really, really bad for rusting all the time, okay? Now, the next thing we want to talk about is probably the thing that's going to get the most attention, and that is the action or the pivot on this. It is a slip joint, so there's no lock, but there is this spring, and that spring at the back is quite stiff. As you can see, I have to push pretty hard to actuate this knife, and I have to pull pretty hard to open it, okay? In fact, my 6-year-old picked this knife up and he couldn't do it. And I said, yeah, and I took it from him because you have to push this so hard that it's a little bit of care is required to not cut yourself when you're opening and closing the knife. And I guess not a little, just keep your fingers out of the way of the knife when it's closing is what you got to do. And I guess that's true of every knife. But there's a reason for the action functioning the way that it does, okay? So what they're thinking here is we have a knife that doesn't lock. So how do we avoid someone or make it a little tougher to close this knife on your fingers? And the way they've done that is put these multiple blade stops. So let's say you're working away, maybe you're cutting twine off a bale and you push the knife backward a little bit. Well, it's going to stop there and you're going to go, whoa, okay, need to be more careful. But because of that blade stop, it didn't close on my fingers. All right. And even if you went even a little further than that, it's going to stop again and again. Hopefully, in all of those, by having all of those stops, it's going to stop you, or at least restrict how much or how badly you cut yourself. Okay. By the way, the Band-Aid on my finger is from this knife. I tried to record this earlier, and I dropped the knife and decided stupidly to catch it. And of course, I got a little cut. Anyway, let me demonstrate another slip joint so you can see the difference. Okay, so here's the case Workman. It is softer, but it's not super soft. But there's no blade stop here. So once I kind of break that initial, I break that sort of initial spring tension. Now the blade just slides closed all the way. A lot of traditionals have a stop here at the halfway point. And I can remember when I was a kid playing a game, maybe someone can remind me of the name of it, you'd stick the knife in here and flip it and get points based on how it landed. I can't remember all the details now, but I do remember playing it with my grandpa. Anyway, back to the knife we want to talk about. Just point out that difference in the number of blade stops. So notice, and let me say this, I'm struggling on camera because I'm reaching around a camera and a tripod and I'm trying to keep it in frame. In real life, I don't have that much trouble opening and closing this knife, and you won't either. It is a little exaggerated in this awkward situation. Finally, let's talk about the handle. There are tons of different colors of these available, and if you look on Blade HQ, they don't have any in stock. They're discontinued, so they won't have any in stock, but you will be able to see all the different colors. And on Lamnia.com, where I got this one, they had 5 or 6 different colors available. So that may be something appealing to some of you. The layered G10 with the blue was most interesting to me, so that's what I went with. So let's now talk about this handle, how it functions, and what I think about it. Number one, the spring here is very, very stiff, so keep that in mind. If you're into traditionals, this is one of the stiffer springs that I've felt. By the way, that whole discussion, I'm not even going to try to get into it because it's way beyond my depth, but the way the knife locks in place and closes, the way the action feels, is called walk and talk. So the walk and talk on this knife is sort of this feel right here, how it feels when it's first closed and then how it goes past all of those different blade stops. Okay, and it is very stiff, just before we move on. Okay, handle, G10, blue and black layered G10, or a number of other colors. It is really comfortable and rather grippy in hand. A couple little sharp spots here on the bottom. So as I run my finger along the bottom of the handle there, the ridges in this sort of sunburst pattern create like a little sawtooth effect, and it's pretty stiff. Now on mine, I have rubbed this with a little bit of sandpaper and it's actually pretty good. So but just know that the corners are just a little sharp on that handle, but not uncomfortable. And I've actually got quite a bit of use on this. Okay, and I'll talk about that when we get to where I sort of see this or envision this in my collection. Single position pocket clip works really well. What else is there to really say about this? Not that much. You know, it's comfortable, it's a little small, and again, this is not a tactical knife. Okay, this is not a hard use knife. So there's no, you know, big choil or anything here holding you from slipping up onto the blade. Also, there's no jimping because it doesn't make sense. You don't want to put a lot of pressure on the back of this knife. There's no lock, okay? So don't push down with your thumb really hard unless it's when you're cutting, all right? So handle is comfortable and functional and fairly attractive, as is the pocket clip. It is single position only, okay? Now, let me get into some comparisons, and here's where you're going to see some differences. Most obvious comparison, of course, is another slip joint. This is the Case Workman, I believe, a larger slip joint. And this is, by the way, just a very budget-friendly knife, and I'll often carry this if I'm carrying something more expensive and I want something to hand to someone who says, hey, can I borrow your knife? I go, yeah, here, use this one. I also, by the way, remind that it doesn't lock, so don't cut their fingers off. And I mean, I've never had problems with it. Most people, in fact, are more familiar with a non-locking knife than they are a locking knife. So that's the first and most obvious comparison. Now the quality of this, the steel is better, the handle is out of tougher and more comfortable materials. This guy is a little slick, and this is not super traditional either. I mean, it's just standard blue, and it's a little kind of old-timey looking, but you know, not to the extent, you know, of a bone handle with bolsters and everything else. So if you're interested in this, maybe the Case Workman would appeal to you as well. And I will at some point do a full review on this knife. It's about the same weight as well, by the way. Now, what if you do want more modern features? Where do you go from there? Well, you know, there's an obvious choice. The Rat Model 1 is a little cheaper. This one's also in D2 steel. It's going to be a little more comfortable, a little easier to handle, and of course it locks, so you're not quite as worried about the blade closing on your fingers. And a lock, by the way, does work better than the system they've employed here. A couple of cold steels that I feel like are very good, sort of non-scary. This is a great example. And where I find a similarity between these two is they're both very utility-oriented knives, just meant for working, and they're not super scary. A blade like this is not going to intimidate too many people, okay? And of course, neither is this. What else have we got here? Let's grab another cold steel, the American Lawman. Again, this is one of the better, more highly recommended cold steel knives that's out there. It's comfortable, it's well built, the blade is really, really utility oriented, and of course this is nice and small and lightweight, so it carries really easily as well. Here's a real steel. Now, by the way, I should point out that if you're interested in this, Reich Knives has a bunch of sort of slip joint, Swiss Army style knives that you may want to check out because they're more modern materials and they're in a decent steel 14C28N. That's what this is, 14C28N. This is real steel, not Reich. But again, I'm bringing this out because it's a very utility-based knife that I don't find terribly scary. I wouldn't be too hesitant to pull this out in a crowd. One more, and I think this will be the most expensive knife I have here today. This is the Benchmade Freak. This is a new knife. Again, very aimed at utility, very aimed at EDC. And like this knife, you know, I wouldn't consider this a hard use knife or even really a tactical knife, although it could be flexed into that. And I mean, any blade could be if you're in an absolute dire need. So there's some comparisons for you. Now, let's finish this off by asking, how does this do in its role? As you know, this is trying to be a knife that's going to be appealing to people, and is it? In some ways, I think yes. Ultimately, let me say, maybe yes and no, okay? So no, because you know, they didn't sell enough to keep them going. So this is a discontinued knife, and that's a little bit sad because I could see this being a nice addition to a lot of people's collection, especially for those days, those times where they need to carry something that is, very sheeple friendly. And this certainly is that, or for those people who, for legal reasons, can't carry a locking knife or need to carry a two-handed opening knife. Again, this is designed to meet those criteria while still being pretty stiff. And that's why, again, it's so stiff in the spring. It's designed to not close on your fingers very easily. And that's sort of an extra safety step since there's no lock, okay? So legal concerns, someone who wants a non-scary knife. Again, I think this would work well as a gift. A lot of people would take this and carry it because to them, they don't want to carry a weapon. They would only carry a tool. And this is absolutely that. This is not a scary knife at all. It's in very bright, sort of cartoonish colors. It's not very big. And yet it still has a pocket clip for convenience. So I could see this working really well as a gift, especially to sort of a non-knife person. This could also work well as a secondary carry. If maybe I'm carrying a fixed blade that day, or I'm carrying, I don't know, a cold steel large espada, and I want something that I can take out other than the large knife, a Spyderco Zabo or something, then this would be a good sort of secondary carry that you can use in that role. It is well built. It is very functional, but it does just have those limitations of being a knife you're not going to flick open, and you're really not going to play with this knife or fondle it, and it doesn't lock for you. Okay, so outside of those two considerations, this is a really good knife. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear your comments below, whether this is something you would be interested in or not. Or if maybe there are some of you out there who normally do sort of a traditional, sort of a typical modern folder, maybe something like this, but then you also have a couple of traditionals that you use on days where you want something that's a little more sheeple friendly. Hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will talk to you soon.